Your African hair is too much. You need to let me fix it.
She was 8 years old, sitting peacefully in first class with her mother, when a flight attendant told her that her natural hair was drawing attention and needed to be fixed. But what happened next shocked everyone on that plane, and the moment was caught on camera. I'm going to tell you a story that will make your blood boil, but I promise you by the end justice will be served. This is about Dr. Simone Williams and her daughter Zara, a brilliant little girl whose only crime was existing while black. And it's about Karen Matthews, a flight attendant who thought she had the power to police a child's appearance 35,000 feet in the air. What she didn't know was that her actions would cost her everything. But before I tell you how we got to that moment, with Karen's hands reaching toward Zara's hair and Simone grabbing her wrist, let me take you back to where this story really begins. Because to understand what happened on Prestige Airlines Flight 447, you need to know who these people really are. Dr. Simone Williams was 38 years old, and if you looked at her resume, you'd see someone who had achieved what most people only dream of. She was a pediatric surgeon, one of the few black female pediatric surgeons in the entire country. She'd spent 15 years cutting into tiny hearts and lungs, saving children's lives while fighting an uphill battle in a medical system that questioned her competence at every turn. But Simone's greatest achievement wasn't her medical degree from Johns Hopkins or her position at Mount Sinai Hospital. It was the little girl sitting beside her, reading a book about space exploration with the kind of focus most adults couldn't muster. Zara Williams was 8 years old, but she carried herself with a quiet confidence that came from being loved completely. She had her mother's warm brown eyes and her father's brilliant smile, though Marcus Williams had been gone for 3 years now. Cancer had taken him when Zara was only 5, and in the aftermath, Simone had made a choice. She would raise their daughter to be exactly who Marcus had wanted her to be, unapologetically herself. And part of that self was Zara's hair. Her beautiful, natural, thick afro that crowned her head like a halo. Marcus had started the tradition when Zara was 3 years old, sitting her down every Sunday morning to carefully pick out her curls, telling her stories about their ancestors while he worked. He taught her that her hair wasn't something to hide or tame, it was a connection to generations of black women and men who had worn their natural hair as an act of resistance, of pride, of self-love. When Marcus died, Simone took over that Sunday ritual. Every week, she'd sit Zara down, carefully separate her curls, apply oil and moisture, and pick out her afro while sharing the same stories Marcus had told. Stories about their great-grandmother who had refused to straighten her hair in the 1930s when it could cost you a job. Stories about the natural hair movement of the 70s, about Angela Davis and her iconic afro. Stories about resistance and beauty and the radical act of taking up space. That Sunday morning before their flight had been no different. Simone had woken up early, prepared Zara's breakfast, and then spent 45 minutes on her daughter's hair. She'd sectioned it carefully, applied leave-in conditioner, and picked it out until it formed a perfect, round cloud around Zara's face. Zara had watched in the mirror, asking questions about the conference her mother was attending in Miami. "You're going to teach other doctors?" Zara had asked. "I'm going to speak about how we can make healthcare better for everyone," Simone had explained, her hands never stopping their gentle work. "About how sometimes doctors have biases they don't even know about and how those biases can hurt people." "Like racism?" Zara had asked. She was 8, but she wasn't naive. Simone had never hidden the realities of the world from her daughter. "Yes, baby. Like racism." "Will I face racism?" Zara's question had been so direct, so innocent, that Simone's hands had paused for just a moment. "You might," Simone had answered honestly. "But when you do, you remember what Daddy taught you. You stand tall, you speak your truth, and you never, ever shrink yourself to make someone else comfortable." Zara had nodded seriously, and Simone had finished her hair, stepping back to admire her work. The afro was perfect, full, healthy, shaped beautifully. Zara had turned her head from side to side in the mirror, grinning. "Daddy would love it," she'd said. "Daddy would be so proud," Simone had whispered, kissing the top of her daughter's head. 4 hours later, they were at JFK Airport, rolling their carry-on bags through the terminal. Simone wore her natural hair in elegant twists, professional attire that commanded respect, or at least it should have. Zara walked beside her, backpack decorated with planets and stars bouncing against her shoulders, completely unaware of the looks they were getting. And they were getting looks. The kind Simone had learned to recognize over 38 years of living while black in America. The double takes. The slight narrowing of eyes. The assumptions being made in split seconds. At the security checkpoint, the TSA agent had patted down Simone's twists thoroughly, randomly selecting her for additional screening while waving white passengers through. Simone had stood there, arms outstretched, jaw clenched, while Zara watched with worried eyes. "It's okay, baby," Simone had murmured. "Just procedure." But it wasn't just procedure, and they both knew it. At the gate, the agent had looked at their boarding passes, first class, seats 2A and 2B, and her eyebrows had risen in surprise. She checked their IDs twice, as if certain there must be some mistake. As if a black woman and her daughter couldn't possibly belong in first class. Simone had said nothing. She'd learned when to fight and when to conserve her energy. She had a keynote speech to give in Miami, a speech about implicit bias in healthcare that could influence hundreds of doctors. She couldn't afford to arrive emotionally exhausted from battling every microaggression along the way. So she'd smiled tightly, taken their boarding passes, and guided Zara down the jetway. The flight attendants had greeted them at the door with professional smiles, directing them to their seats. Simone had helped Zara stow her backpack, buckled her in by the window, and settled into the aisle seat herself. She'd pulled out her tablet with her conference notes, highlighting key statistics about maternal mortality rates among black women, about pain medication being disproportionately denied to black patients, about the literal life and death consequences of racial bias in medicine. Zara had pulled out her book, Astrophysics for Young People by Neil deGrasse Tyson, and immersed herself in theories about black holes and the expanding universe. Around them, first class filled with the usual passengers, business executives in expensive suits, an elderly couple celebrating an anniversary, a young woman typing frantically on her laptop. In seat 3C, directly behind Zara, sat Michael Chen, a 45-year-old corporate attorney heading to Miami for depositions. He'd glanced at Simone and Zara with the same polite disinterest he showed everyone, settling in with his own paperwork. Then Karen Matthews had appeared. 52 years old, with 28 years of experience as a flight attendant for Prestige Airlines, Karen had the kind of professional demeanor that came from decades of customer service. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, her makeup perfectly applied, her uniform crisp and pressed. She moved through first class with practiced efficiency, greeting passengers with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. But when she reached row 2 and saw Simone and Zara, something changed. It was subtle, the smile didn't fade, but it tightened. Her eyes swept over them, lingering on Zara's afro, and for just a fraction of a second, her lips pressed into a thin line. Then the professional mask was back in place, and she was greeting them with the same pleasant voice she'd used for everyone else. "Welcome aboard," she'd said. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" "We're fine, thank you," Simone had replied, her voice warm but not overly friendly. She'd recognized that look, that brief flash of something that could have been disapproval or discomfort or simple prejudice. Karen had moved on, but not before glancing back at Zara's hair one more time. In the galley, she turned to Jessica Martinez, a 29-year-old flight attendant who'd been with Prestige for only 2 years. Jessica was still idealistic, still believed that excellent service meant treating every passenger with genuine warmth. She'd noticed Karen's expression and felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. "Keep an eye on 2A and 2B, Karen had murmured, her voice low enough that only Jessica could hear. "Is something wrong?" Jessica had asked, confused. She'd seen nothing concerning about the woman and child in row 2. "Just watch them," Karen had repeated, and something in her tone had made Jessica's unease deepen into actual concern. But Jessica was new. She was still learning the ropes, still trying to prove herself. And Karen was senior, experienced, someone Jessica had been told to learn from. So she'd nodded, even as something in her gut told her this wasn't right. The plane had begun boarding the remaining passengers, economy class filing past first class with envious glances at the spacious seats and complimentary champagne. Simone had noticed how some of them had looked at her and Zara with surprise, as if seeing black passengers in first class disrupted their expectations of how the world should be ordered. She'd felt Zara tense beside her, picking up on the energy even if she couldn't articulate what it meant. "Mommy, why is everyone looking at us?" Zara had whispered. Simone had squeezed her hand. "They're probably just admiring your beautiful hair, baby." It was a lie, but a kind one. Zara had smiled and returned to her book, reassured. Simone had returned to her notes, but her jaw was tight. She'd flown first class before. Her position as a surgeon and her speaking fees made it affordable, and she'd learned that her presence in that cabin was often treated as an anomaly that needed explaining. But she'd never let it stop her, and she wouldn't start now. The plane had pushed back from the gate, the captain's voice coming over the intercom with the standard announcements about flight time and weather conditions. Simone had barely registered it, focused on her work. Zara had pressed her face to the window, watching New York City shrink beneath them as they climbed into the clear morning sky. Service had begun about 20 minutes into the flight. Karen had moved through first class with her cart, offering drinks and snacks with that same professional smile. But Simone had noticed something. When Karen reached the elderly white couple in row 1, she'd offered them warm nuts and champagne, describing the premium snack options in detail. The business executive in row 4 had received the same treatment. But when Karen reached Simone and Zara, her offer had been different. Water? Juice? She'd asked curtly, not mentioning the premium options, not offering the warm nuts or champagne or any of the other complimentary items first-class passengers were entitled to. Simone had felt the slight like a paper cut, small but stinging. "What other options do you have?" she'd asked, her voice even. Karen's smile had tightened again. "Oh well, we have some pretzels, cookies." "I noticed you offered warm nuts to the other passengers," Simone had said calmly. "Are those available?" "Of course," Karen had replied, but her tone suggested Simone was being difficult. She'd handed over the warm nuts with a bit more force than necessary, then moved on quickly. Zara had looked up at her mother with questioning eyes. "Mommy, why did she sound mad?" Simone had stroked her daughter's cheek. "She's just busy, baby. Don't worry about it." But Simone was worried. She'd recognized the pattern, the subtle way service workers could make you feel unwelcome without ever saying anything explicitly racist. The tone of voice, the body language, the selective attention. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and Simone had endured it her entire life. Michael Chen, sitting behind them, had noticed too. As a corporate attorney who specialized in employment discrimination cases, he developed a sharp eye for these dynamics. He'd seen Karen's different demeanor with Simone and Zara versus the other passengers. He'd heard the edge in her voice. And something had made him quietly activate the voice recording app on his phone, sliding it into his shirt pocket. He'd learned to trust his instincts about these situations. 30 minutes into the flight, Zara had fallen asleep, her head resting against the window, her book slipping from her hands into her lap. And as she slept, her afro had done what natural hair does. It had expanded slightly, the curls relaxing, the volume increasing. It was beautiful, this halo of hair framing her sleeping face. It wasn't blocking anything or bothering anyone. The aisle was completely clear. But to Karen Matthews, walking past on her way to check on passengers, it was apparently a problem. She'd stopped at row 2, staring at Zara's hair with an expression that Simone caught in her peripheral vision. Simone had looked up from her notes to find Karen standing there, hands on her hips, lips pursed in disapproval. "Yes?" Simone had asked, her tone carefully neutral. "Your daughter's hair," Karen had said, and those 3 words had sent ice down Simone's spine. "It's getting quite large." Simone had felt every muscle in her body tense. She'd carefully set down her tablet, giving herself a moment to control her initial response. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Her hair is beautiful and natural." "I'm sure it is," Karen had replied, her tone dripping with false reasonableness. "But it's blocking the aisle, and it's drawing attention from the other passengers." Simone had looked at the aisle. It was completely clear. You could have rolled a cart through without touching a single hair on Zara's head. She'd looked around at the other passengers. Most were absorbed in their own activities. No one was paying any attention to Zara except Karen. "It's not blocking anything," Simone had said, her professional demeanor beginning to crack. "And the only person paying attention to it is you." Karen's smile had turned brittle. "Ma'am, I'm just trying to maintain standards for all our passengers' comfort." "Standards?" Simone had repeated, and now there was steel in her voice. "My daughter is sleeping. Her hair is natural. There is nothing wrong with it, nothing that needs to be fixed or changed or managed. Do you understand?" They'd locked eyes then, and in that moment, Simone had seen it clearly. The prejudice Karen was trying to disguise as professionalism, the discomfort with black natural hair that Karen was trying to frame as concern for other passengers. Simone had seen it 1,000 times before in 1,000 different contexts. But she'd never seen it directed at her child, and the protective fury that rose in her chest was unlike anything she'd experienced before. Karen had stepped back, her face flushing. "There's no need to get defensive," she'd said, a classic deflection. "I'm not defensive," Simone had replied. "I'm clear. Do not comment on my daughter's hair again." Karen had retreated to the galley, but Simone had seen her whispering to Jessica, gesturing toward their row. Jessica had looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Karen and Simone with visible distress. Whatever Karen was saying, Jessica clearly didn't agree with it, but she wasn't speaking up either. Michael Chen had heard the entire exchange. His recording was running. And he'd made a decision: if this escalated, he wasn't going to stay silent. Simone had tried to return to her work, but her hands were shaking. She'd looked down at her daughter, still sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that she'd just been subjected to the kind of discrimination that Simone had spent her whole life fighting against. Zara's face was relaxed in sleep, her lips slightly parted, one hand curled under her cheek. She looked so innocent, so perfectly herself. And Simone had felt a wave of grief for what she knew was coming, because this wouldn't be the last time someone tried to make Zara feel like she needed to change, to shrink, to conform. But it would be the first time Zara learned that her mother would fight back. Because what Simone didn't know yet was that Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. 10 minutes passed. Simone had forced herself to focus on her notes, trying to channel her anger into the work that mattered. Her keynote speech was about implicit bias, about how healthcare providers' unconscious prejudices led to worse outcomes for Black patients. She'd been planning to use statistics, case studies, peer-reviewed research. But now she had a fresh, raw example of exactly what she was talking about. The way Karen had looked at Zara, the way she'd found a problem where none existed, the way she'd used coded language like drawing attention and standards. It was implicit bias in action. Zara had stirred in her sleep, shifting position, her afro brushing against the seat. Still not blocking anything. Still not bothering anyone. But Simone had seen Karen watching from the galley, her expression tight with what looked like determination. And then Karen had disappeared into the galley for several minutes. When she emerged, she was carrying something, a small spray bottle and what looked like a hair tie. Simone's heart had started pounding when she saw where Karen was heading. Straight toward row 2. Straight toward her sleeping daughter. "Excuse me," Karen had said, her voice saccharine sweet. "I thought I could help make your daughter more comfortable." She'd held up the spray bottle, some kind of conditioning spray, and the hair tie. And before Simone could even process what was happening, Karen had reached out toward Zara's sleeping head. That's when Simone had moved. Pure instinct, pure protective fury. Her hand had shot out and grabbed Karen's wrist before those fingers could touch a single curl on her daughter's head. "Do not touch my daughter." Each word had come out like a bullet, low and deadly serious. Zara had woken up, startled by the commotion, her eyes wide and frightened as she looked up to see her mother gripping the flight attendant's wrist, their faces inches apart. Passengers were turning now, phones coming out, the entire cabin riveted by the confrontation unfolding in row 2. Zara had shrunk back against the window, tears welling in her eyes, confused and frightened by seeing her mother so angry, by the flight attendant standing over them, by suddenly being the center of attention. "Mommy?" Her voice was small, scared. "Did I do something wrong?" And that question, that heartbreaking question from a child who'd just been woken up to find an adult trying to fix her, that's what made everything that came next inevitable. Because Simone heard in those words the beginning of something she'd sworn would never happen to her daughter. The beginning of shame. The beginning of thinking she needed to change to be acceptable. The beginning of shrinking herself. "Ma'am, I was just trying to help," Karen had stammered, trying to pull her wrist free from Simone's grip. "The hair is unruly and unprofessional and I thought." Unprofessional? Simone had stood up, still holding Karen's wrist, her voice rising now, all pretense of calm shattered. "She is 8 years old. She's a child. And you think you have the right to touch her, to change her appearance, to make her think there's something wrong with her natural hair?" "I didn't mean it like that," Karen had protested, her own voice rising in defense. "I just thought it would be better if..." Better? Simone had released Karen's wrist, but only so she could step fully into the aisle, putting herself between Karen and her daughter. Better for whom? For you? Because you're uncomfortable with black hair? Because you think a little girl's afro is somehow inappropriate or needs to be tamed? The word tamed had hung in the air and everyone in first class had felt its weight. Because that's what this was really about, wasn't it? The idea that black hair in its natural state was wild, uncontrolled, something that needed to be managed and subdued. The same thinking that had led to dress codes banning locks and braids, to black children being sent home from school for their hair, to centuries of messaging that black features needed to be altered to be acceptable. Karen's face had gone red. "You're twisting my words. I never said anything about race." "You didn't have to," Simone had replied, and her voice was quieter now but somehow more powerful. "You said it when you offered everyone else premium snacks but gave us pretzels. You said it when you told your colleague to watch us. You said it when you looked at my sleeping daughter and decided her natural hair was a problem that needed fixing. You said it in 1,000 ways without ever using the words. Other passengers had started speaking up then. Margaret Sullivan, a white woman in her 60s sitting in row 4, had turned around in her seat. "Leave them alone," she'd said firmly. "There's nothing wrong with that beautiful child. I've been watching and you've been targeting them since we boarded." A younger black woman across the aisle had added her voice. "I saw the whole thing. She wasn't blocking anything. You went out of your way to harass her." Michael Chen had stood up, his phone clearly visible now. "I've been recording this entire interaction," he'd announced. "And I'm a civil rights attorney. What you just did, attempting to touch that child without permission, harassing them based on appearance, creating a hostile environment, that's not just bad customer service. That's discrimination." Karen had looked around at the sea of faces, and for the first time, real fear had crossed her expression. She'd been so certain she was right, so convinced she was just maintaining professional standards. But now she was seeing herself through everyone else's eyes, and the reflection wasn't pretty. Jessica had stepped forward from where she'd been hovering uncertainly in the galley. Her voice was shaking, but she spoke anyway. "Karen, maybe we should get the captain." "I don't need the captain," Karen had snapped, her composure cracking completely now. "I am the senior flight attendant on this aircraft, and I have the authority to maintain order and standards." "What you have," Simone had interrupted, her voice cutting like a scalpel, "is a problem with black people existing in spaces you think belong to you. My daughter's hair is not unruly. It's not unprofessional. It's not drawing attention. It's black. And if that makes you uncomfortable, that's your issue to deal with, not ours." Zara had been crying silently this whole time, tears streaming down her cheeks. She'd pressed herself against the window, trying to disappear, her hands instinctively going to her hair as if to hide it. And seeing her confident, brilliant daughter trying to make herself smaller, had broken something in Simone. She turned away from Karen and knelt down beside Zara's seat, taking her daughter's hands gently. "Baby, look at me. Look at mommy." Zara had met her eyes, her face streaked with tears. "You did nothing wrong. Do you hear me? Nothing. Your hair is perfect. You are perfect. And anyone who tries to tell you different is wrong. Do you understand?" Zara had nodded, but fresh tears had spilled over. "She said it was bad," she'd whispered. "No, baby. She said she was uncomfortable. And that's her problem, not yours. Don't you ever let someone make you feel ashamed of who you are." It had been a private moment in a very public space, and the other passengers had watched with a mixture of sympathy and anger. Because everyone there understood what they were witnessing, not just a dispute between a passenger and a flight attendant, but a mother trying to protect her daughter from a poison that society kept trying to feed black children. The poison of self-hatred. The poison of thinking they needed to change to be worthy. Karen had tried one more time. "I'm going to report this to the captain. You've created a disturbance on this flight." "Please do," Michael Chen had said, his voice cold and professional. "Because I'm going to report what I witnessed and I have video evidence. I'm also going to report that you racially profiled a passenger and her minor child, created a hostile environment, and attempted to make unauthorized physical contact with that child. I have witnesses." He gestured to Margaret Sullivan and several other passengers who were nodding. Karen had looked at Jessica, her last hope for support. But Jessica had stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't, Karen. What you did was wrong. I should have said something earlier, but I'm saying it now. This was wrong." And that's when Karen had done something that sealed her fate. Instead of backing down, instead of apologizing, she doubled down. "You're all acting like I committed some terrible crime. All I did was try to help a child look more presentable. If that's racist, then I guess everything is racist these days. I guess you can't say anything anymore without someone claiming discrimination." The words had landed like stones in water, ripples spreading through first class. Because there it was, the real Karen Matthews. Not the professional flight attendant with her pleasant smile and practiced manners. The woman who thought a black child's natural hair made her unpresentable. The woman who viewed being called racist as worse than actually being racist. The woman who saw accountability as oppression. Simone had stood up slowly, and when she spoke, every word was deliberate. "You just made this very simple. I want the captain. I want your supervisor. I want every witness's contact information. And I want you away from my daughter." Karen had opened her mouth to respond, but Jessica had grabbed her arm. "Karen, stop. Just stop. I'm getting the captain." Jessica had hurried to the cockpit while Karen stood frozen in the aisle, finally seeming to realize the magnitude of what she'd done. The other passengers had returned to their seats, but the atmosphere in first class had changed completely. What had started as a routine flight was now something none of them would ever forget. Michael Chen had approached Simone quietly. "I'm serious about my offer," he'd said. "I specialize in civil rights cases. What she did, that's actionable. And it needs to be documented so it doesn't happen to the next family." Simone had nodded, taking his card. "Thank you." "Really?" Margaret Sullivan had leaned over from her seat. "I have 3 grandchildren. If anyone tried to touch their hair without permission, I'd have done the same thing you did. You were absolutely right to stop her." The validation had meant something, but Simone had barely registered it. All her attention was on Zara, who'd curled up in her seat, her face buried in her mother's jacket. Simone had stroked her daughter's back, whispering reassurances, trying to undo the damage that had been done in those few terrible minutes. And then the cockpit door had opened and Captain Robert Hayes had emerged. He was a distinguished-looking black man in his 50s, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding immediate respect. He'd taken in the scene, Simone standing protectively over Zara, Karen pale and defensive in the aisle, Jessica looking relieved that he'd arrived, and the other passengers watching tensely. But when his eyes had landed on Simone, recognition had flickered across his face. "Dr. Williams?" Simone had looked up, equally surprised. "Captain Hayes?" They'd met before. His daughter had gone to medical school with Simone, and they'd crossed paths at a family event years ago. But more than that, Captain Hayes had his own connection to this issue. His granddaughter wore her natural hair in beautiful locks, and he'd been there when she'd faced discrimination at school, when teachers had called her hair distracting, and tried to make her change. He understood exactly what was happening here. "What's going on?" he'd asked, though his eyes were already moving to Karen with a look that suggested he had a pretty good idea. Karen had jumped in immediately, trying to control the narrative. "Captain, there's been a situation with passengers in row 2. They became aggressive when I tried to address a safety and comfort issue." "Stop." Captain Hayes had held up his hand and Karen's mouth had snapped shut. He turned to Simone. "Dr. Williams, what happened?" And Simone had told him. Calmly, precisely, leaving nothing out. The differential service. The comments about Zara's hair. The attempt to touch her sleeping daughter without permission. The things Karen had said. When she finished, Captain Hayes had stood silent for a moment, his jaw tight. Then he turned to the other passengers. "Did anyone else witness this?" Hands had gone up across first class. Margaret Sullivan had spoken up, confirming everything. Michael Chen had offered his recording. Even passengers who'd been working or reading had corroborated the basic facts. Karen had singled out the woman and child in row 2, had made comments about the child's hair, had tried to touch her. Captain Hayes had asked Karen to step into the galley. Their conversation had been quiet but tense, and those sitting nearby could hear fragments. Karen trying to justify herself. The captain's voice, low and firm, shutting down her excuses. Jessica being called over to give her account. And then the captain's voice, clearer now, "You're suspended for the remainder of this flight. You'll sit in the crew rest area, and we'll be filing a full report when we land." Karen's shock had been visible. "You can't do this. I've been with this airline for 28 years. Then you should know better than to harass passengers, especially children," Captain Hayes had replied. "This isn't the first complaint about you. It's just the first one we can't ignore." Those words had hung in the air. This wasn't the first time. Karen had done this before, maybe not exactly this but variations of it. The microaggressions, the targeted service, the discomfort with black passengers in first class. And the airline had looked the other way, had dismissed complaints, had protected her because nothing had been quite egregious enough to force their hand. Until now. Until she tried to put her hands on a child's hair. Until she'd done it in front of witnesses with phones. Until she'd said the quiet part loud enough that it couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Karen had tried one more protest, but Captain Hayes had been done. "Jessica will escort you to the crew rest area. If you refuse, we'll land at the nearest airport and have you removed from the aircraft. Your choice." It hadn't really been a choice. Karen had followed Jessica toward the back of the plane, her face a mask of resentment and humiliation. She still didn't look sorry. She looked angry. Angry at being caught, angry at facing consequences, angry at a world that was changing in ways she couldn't control or understand. Captain Hayes had returned to row 2, where Simone was still comforting Zara. He'd crouched down to be at eye level with the little girl. "Zara? My name is Captain Hayes. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That flight attendant was completely wrong, and she's not going to bother you anymore. Zara had peeked out from her mother's jacket, her eyes red from crying. She said my hair was bad. Your hair is beautiful, Captain Hayes had said firmly. You know what? My granddaughter has hair kind of like yours, she wears locks. And she's the most beautiful girl in the world, just like you are. Some people just don't understand that yet. But that's their problem, not yours. He'd reached into his pocket and pulled out a pin, the kind pilots give to kids who are nervous about flying. But this one was special, the captain's own wings. You were very brave today. Braver than a lot of adults would have been. I want you to have this, okay? It means you're an honorary member of my flight crew. Zara had taken the pin carefully, and for the first time since waking up, she'd smiled a little. Thank you. Captain Hayes had stood and turned to Simone. His voice was lower now, meant just for her. I'm going to file a full report. This kind of behavior is unacceptable and it won't be tolerated. I'm also authorizing a full refund of your tickets and flight credits for future travel. And if there's anything else you need, anything at all, you let me know. I appreciate that, Simone had said quietly. But what I really need is for this to not happen to the next black mother and child who get on a plane. I understand. And I can tell you that this incident will be documented, reviewed, and acted upon. That flight attendant won't be working for Prestige Airlines after today. I can promise you that. After Captain Hayes returned to the cockpit, the flight had continued in relative quiet. The other passengers had given Simone and Zara space, though several had approached to offer support, to share their own stories, to express their outrage at what they'd witnessed. Michael Chen had made sure Simone had his information, had explained the process for filing a formal complaint, had offered to represent her if she wanted to pursue legal action. Margaret Sullivan had shared that she'd been a teacher for 30 years, and she'd seen black students policed for their hair too many times. I should have spoken up more when I was teaching, she'd said. I should have challenged the dress codes that targeted black children. I'm glad you stood up today. Your daughter needed to see that. Simone had thanked them all, but inside she was exhausted. Not physically, though confrontation always took a toll, but emotionally. Because this was the weight black parents carried every single day. The knowledge that they had to prepare their children for a world that would judge them, police them, try to diminish them. The responsibility of building up their confidence while also teaching them the harsh realities of racism. The constant vigilance required to protect them from 1,000 small cuts that could bleed them dry. Zara had stayed quiet for most of the remaining flight, looking out the window, holding the captain's pin. Simone had watched her daughter and wondered what was going through that brilliant young mind. Was she replaying what happened? Was she questioning whether her hair really was wrong? Was this the moment that would plant the seed of doubt that Simone had worked so hard to prevent? Finally, as they began their descent into Miami, Zara had turned to her mother. Mommy, am I going to have to deal with people like that lady my whole life? The question had broken Simone's heart, but she'd answered honestly. Sometimes, baby. Not everyone, but some people. People who don't understand or who are scared of things that are different from them. But why? My hair doesn't hurt anyone. No, it doesn't. And that's the unfair part. You'll have to deal with people's prejudices even though you haven't done anything wrong. But you know what else? You'll also meet people like Captain Hayes, like Mr. Chen, like that nice lady who stood up for you. People who see how special you are and love you for exactly who you are. Will it get better when I grow up? Simone had pulled her daughter close. It's getting better. Slowly. People are speaking up more, standing up more. And you know what helps? People like you, being brave and proud and refusing to hide who you are. Every time you wear your hair like this and hold your head high, you're making it a little bit better for the next little girl. Zara had thought about this. Like Daddy used to say? About being the change? Exactly like Daddy used to say. The plane had landed smoothly, but instead of the usual rush to deplane, passengers had been asked to remain seated. Within minutes, 2 people in business attire had boarded. David Park, Prestige Airlines regional manager, and Amanda Foster, their PR director. They'd gone straight to the cockpit first, where Captain Hayes had briefed them and shown them Michael Chen's recording. When they'd emerged, their expressions had been grim. They'd called Karen forward from the crew rest area, and what followed had been swift and decisive. Karen had tried to defend herself, had tried to spin the narrative, had insisted she'd just been doing her job. But David Park had pulled out a tablet and shown her the video. Shown her reaching for Zara's hair. Shown her face when she'd said unprofessable. Shown her dismissive response when confronted about her behavior. And then Amanda had pulled up social media on her tablet. Because Michael Chen hadn't just recorded the incident, he'd posted it. And in the hours since, it had gone viral. Hashtags were trending. News outlets were picking it up. Thousands of people were sharing their own stories of hair discrimination. The NAACP had already issued a statement. Civil rights organizations were calling for action. Karen had watched her own actions play out on the screen, had seen herself through the world's eyes, and something had shifted in her expression. Maybe it was the first crack in her denial, the first moment of recognizing the impact of her actions. Or maybe it was just fear at facing consequences for something she'd gotten away with for so long. David Park hadn't minced words. "You're terminated, effective immediately. 28 years of service doesn't excuse discrimination. You'll be escorted off the aircraft, and our HR department will be in touch about final paperwork." Karen had tried to protest. "I was doing my job. I was maintaining standards." "Your job is customer service," Amanda had said coldly. "Not hair police. Not racial profiling. Not harassing children. You had multiple complaints about differential service to black passengers over the years. We ignored them. That was our mistake. But we're not ignoring this." Security had escorted Karen off the plane, and the last thing Simone had seen of her was that face, still resentful, still defensive, still not understanding that what she'd done was wrong. Karen would go on conservative podcasts later, would tell her story as if she were the victim, would find people who agreed that you can't say anything anymore without being accused of racism. But she'd lost her job, her reputation, and any claim to the moral high ground. After Karen was gone, David Park had approached Simone personally. "Dr. Williams, on behalf of Prestige Airlines, I want to offer our sincerest apologies. What happened to you and your daughter was completely unacceptable. We're offering a full refund, lifetime flight credits, and a donation to any charity you choose that works on racial justice issues." Simone had accepted graciously, but she'd also been clear. "What I want more than compensation is assurance that this won't happen again. That your airline will train its staff properly, that complaints will be taken seriously, that black passengers won't have to brace themselves for discrimination every time they fly." "You have my word," David had said. "This incident is already prompting policy changes. Mandatory bias training. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. A dedicated team to review complaints. It should have happened sooner, but it's happening now." Jessica had approached Simone before deplaning, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm so sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I knew something was wrong, but I was scared to challenge her. That won't happen again." Simone had seen the genuine remorse in the young woman's face. "You spoke up when it mattered. That took courage. Your daughter deserves better. Every passenger deserves better. I'm testifying to HR about the other times I saw her treat black passengers differently. This wasn't an isolated incident. And that was the truth that needed to be told." Karen Matthews wasn't one bad apple. She was a symptom of a system that had allowed this behavior to continue for years, that had dismissed complaints, that had valued seniority and convenience over accountability and justice. The passengers had finally been allowed to deplane, and Simone and Zara had walked through the Miami airport in a daze. News crews were already there, having caught wind of the viral video, but Simone had declined to comment. "I just want to get my daughter to our hotel," she'd said, shielding Zara from the cameras. They'd been escorted to a VIP lounge where they could decompress in privacy. Zara had curled up on a couch, exhausted from the emotional ordeal. Simone had held her, stroking her hair, that beautiful, natural, perfect hair that had been the catalyst for all of this. Michael Chen had stopped by before his own departure, reiterating his offer. "If you decide to pursue legal action, call me. This kind of discrimination needs to be challenged in court, not just in the court of public opinion. It sets precedents that protect other families." Margaret Sullivan had exchanged contact information, hugging Simone tightly. "You're raising that girl right. Don't let anyone ever tell you different." And Captain Hayes had visited before his next flight, kneeling down to talk to Zara one more time. "You know what I told my granddaughter when she had a bad day because of her hair? I told her that some people are scared of beauty they don't understand. But that doesn't make the beauty any less real. You keep being beautiful, okay?" Zara had nodded, holding onto the captain's pin like it was a talisman. 2 days later, Simone stood at a podium in a Miami convention center, looking out at hundreds of medical professionals gathered for the Healthcare Disparities Conference. She'd rewritten her keynote speech on the first night, incorporating what had happened on the plane. "Implicit bias," she'd begun, "isn't just an abstract concept we discuss in academic papers. It's a lived reality that affects people's lives every single day. 2 days ago, a flight attendant looked at my 8-year-old daughter and saw a problem that needed fixing. Not because my daughter was being disruptive or unsafe, but because her natural black hair made this woman uncomfortable. And when I confronted her about it, she used language we hear all too often in healthcare settings: standards, professionalism, drawing attention. Code words for different from what I expect or approve of. She told the story in full, her voice steady but passionate. And then she'd connected it to healthcare. If a flight attendant can look at a black child and see unprofessionalism instead of beauty, how many doctors look at black patients and see noncompliance instead of barriers to care? How many nurses assume black patients are exaggerating their pain because of unconscious biases about pain tolerance? How many medical professionals miss critical symptoms because they're filtered through assumptions about race? She'd shared the statistics they all knew but often forgot in daily practice. Black women dying in childbirth at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women. Black patients receiving inadequate pain management even after accounting for insurance and income. Black children's symptoms being dismissed or minimized. The literal life and death consequences of the same kind of bias that had led a flight attendant to think an 8-year-old's afro needed to be fixed. The standing ovation had lasted for several minutes. But more importantly, the conversations that followed had been transformative. Doctor after doctor, especially black female physicians, had approached Simone to share their own stories. Stories of being mistaken for nurses despite their white coats. Stories of having their expertise questioned by patients who couldn't believe someone who looked like them could be a surgeon. Stories of code switching and straightening their hair and making themselves smaller to fit into a medical establishment that still saw them as outsiders. And they'd organized. Right there in that conference center, they'd created a network. A support system. An advocacy group dedicated to addressing bias in healthcare and mentoring the next generation of black medical professionals. What Karen Matthews had meant as an attack had become a catalyst for change. A month later, Simone and Zara were back home in New York, settling into their Sunday morning routine. The ritual that had started with Marcus, continued through his death, and survived even the trauma of Flight 447. Simone sat Zara down at their kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through the windows, and began the familiar process of caring for her daughter's hair. She sectioned it carefully, applied leave-in conditioner, and began picking out the curls. Zara sat quietly, holding the captain's pin which she'd kept on her nightstand. "Mommy," Zara said after a while, "I have to do a presentation at school next week. About what makes me special." "Oh yeah? What are you going to talk about?" Zara was quiet for a moment. Then, "My hair." Simone's hands had paused. "Are you sure? You don't have to." "I want to," Zara interrupted. "I want to tell them about Daddy and how he taught me to love my hair. And about our Sundays. And about what happened on the plane." "Baby, you don't have to talk about that if it's too hard." "It was hard," Zara admitted. "But you told me that standing up makes it easier for the next person. And maybe if I tell my class they'll understand better. Maybe they won't be like that lady." Simone had pulled her daughter into a hug, careful not to mess up the section of hair she'd just finished. "You are the bravest person I know. You know that." "I learned from you," Zara had said simply. The following week, Simone had sat in the back of Zara's third-grade classroom and watched her daughter stand in front of 20-some 8-year-olds with a confidence that took Simone's breath away. Zara had brought in photos. One of Marcus doing her hair when she was tiny, one of Simone doing her hair now, one of her with Captain Hayes and his pin. "My hair tells a story," Zara had said to her classmates. "It connects me to my ancestors who wore their hair like this even when people said they shouldn't. It connects me to my dad who died but taught me to love myself before he left. It connects me to my mom who protects me and teaches me to be brave. And yeah, some people don't like it. Some people think it's wrong or messy or unprofessional. But they're wrong. My hair is beautiful because it's mine, and it's natural, and it's part of who I am." She told them about the flight attendant, about what had happened, about how her mother had stood up for her. And then she'd said something that made Simone's eyes well up with tears. "A lot of people stood up for me that day. The captain and the lawyer and even some people I didn't know. And I learned that when something wrong happens, there are people who will help if they see it. But they have to see it. They have to pay attention. So if you ever see someone being mean to somebody because of how they look or where they're from or anything like that, I hope you'll be one of the people who stands up. Because that really matters." The kids had clapped and some had raised their hands with questions. Questions about her hair routine, about her dad, about what it felt like on the plane. Zara had answered them all with a poise that seemed impossible for someone so young. But then again, Simone thought, black children had always been forced to grow up faster, to be more articulate, to justify their existence in ways white children never had to. After school, walking home hand in hand, Zara had been quiet until she'd suddenly said, "Mommy, do you think that lady learned anything?" Simone had thought about Karen Matthews. About the video clips she'd seen of Karen on right-wing podcasts, playing the victim, insisting she'd done nothing wrong. About the GoFundMe someone had started for her that had raised a surprising amount of money from people who saw her firing as cancel culture, rather than accountability. But she'd also read an article, buried deep, not widely shared, about Karen starting therapy. About her adult daughter refusing to speak to her after seeing the video. About small signs that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to understand. It was too early to call it redemption and maybe it would never come. But there were hints of something that might one day become awareness. "I don't know, baby," Simone had answered honestly. "I hope so. But whether she learns or not, other people learned." The airline changed its policies. Thousands of people shared their own stories. Lots of people who might have stayed quiet before will speak up next time. So even if that one lady never gets it, the world got a little bit better anyway. Because I didn't hide my hair? Because you existed exactly as you are, and I protected your right to do that, and other people stood up too. That's how change happens. One moment at a time, one person at a time, until enough moments and enough people add up to something bigger. They'd walked the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, and when they'd arrived, Simone had noticed something. Zara's backpack, which usually got thrown carelessly in the closet, was being set down carefully. She was taking out the captain's pin and placing it on the kitchen table where she did her homework. "What's that for?" Simone had asked. "To remind me," Zara had said, "that I'm brave, that I'm honorary crew, that I don't have to change for anybody." And Simone had realized that this was the moment she'd been fighting for all along. Not the viral video or the policy changes or even the justice of Karen being fired. This moment, right here, where her daughter had faced discrimination and come through it with her sense of self intact. Where Zara had learned that people would try to diminish her but that she had the right to take up space anyway. Where the lesson wasn't hide to stay safe, but shine despite those who want you dim. That evening, Simone had posted on social media for the first time since the incident. Not a long threat, not a detailed account. Just a single photo of Zara doing her homework with the captain's pin beside her notebook and a caption. "To every parent raising black children in a world that will try to tell them they're too much or not enough. Keep reminding them they're exactly right. Keep protecting their joy. Keep teaching them that their existence is not up for debate. And to everyone who stood up for my daughter that day, on the plane, online, in your own lives, thank you. This is how we change things. Together." The post had been shared thousands of times, but Simone barely noticed. She was too busy making dinner, helping with homework, getting ready for another week of saving children's lives and fighting systemic bias in medicine. Being a mother and a surgeon and a black woman navigating a world that still had so far to go. But that night, after Zara was asleep, Simone had stood in her daughter's doorway, watching her breathe, her afro spread across the pillow like a crown. And she thought about Marcus, about how proud he'd be of the woman their daughter was becoming. About how this moment, this terrible, transformative moment, had become part of Zara's story now. Not the defining moment, just one of many that would shape who she'd grow into. And Simone had made a promise, silent but fierce, to her sleeping daughter and to the memory of her husband and to the generations of black women who'd fought these same battles before her. "I will never stop fighting for your right to exist exactly as you are. I will never let the world teach you to shrink. I will never let anyone make you believe that your natural self is anything less than perfect. And I will teach you to fight for yourself so that one day, you won't need me to stand between you and the Karen Matthews of the world. You'll stand there yourself, tall and proud and unapologetic. Because that's what this was really about. Not just one incident on one flight, but the ongoing war against the lie that black people need to change to be acceptable. The fight to raise children who knew their worth in a society that constantly questioned it. The battle to create a world where an 8-year-old could sleep peacefully on a plane without someone deciding her hair was a problem. It was a fight that had been going on for generations before Simone, and it would continue for generations after. But in her small corner of it, in her relationship with her daughter, in the way she'd stood up that day on Flight 447, Simone had won a crucial victory. She'd shown Zara that her mother would always protect her. And more importantly, she'd shown Zara how to protect herself. 6 months later, Jessica Martinez was promoted at Prestige Airlines. Not just promoted, she became the lead trainer for their new mandatory bias and cultural sensitivity program. The program that had been created in direct response to the Flight 447 incident. She'd stood in front of hundreds of flight attendants, showing them the video from that day, watching them squirm with discomfort, forcing them to confront their own biases. "This is what unconscious bias looks like," she'd tell each new training group. "It looks like finding problems where none exist. It looks like differential service. It looks like coded language about professionalism and standards. And it can cost someone their job, cost our company millions in lawsuits and lost business, and most importantly, cost a child their sense of self-worth." The airline had implemented real changes. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. A dedicated team to investigate complaints within 24 hours. Regular audits of service to ensure equity. It wasn't perfect, no policy ever is, but it was progress. And it had only happened because Simone had refused to stay silent, because Michael Chen had recorded evidence, because Captain Hayes had taken action, because Jessica had finally found the courage to speak truth to power. Karen Matthews had become a cautionary tale in those training sessions, though Jessica never used her name. Just a senior flight attendant who let her biases override her judgment and lost a nearly 30-year career because of it. Some trainees would nod knowingly, having worked with Karen. Others would shift uncomfortably, recognizing behaviors they'd exhibited themselves. A few would push back, insisting it was all an overreaction, that you can't do anything anymore without someone claiming discrimination. But Jessica had learned how to handle those objections. She'd learned from the best, from watching Dr. Simone Williams calmly, firmly stand her ground in the face of injustice. "If you think protecting a child from having her hair touched without permission is an overreaction," Jessica would say, "then we need to have a deeper conversation about boundaries and respect." Meanwhile, Michael Chen had used the Flight 447 case in his civil rights practice. Not the case itself. Simone had ultimately decided not to sue, accepting the airline's settlement and policy changes as sufficient, but as an example in other cases. He played that video in depositions, in settlement negotiations, in courtrooms, showing what implicit bias looked like in action. It had become a powerful teaching tool, a clear illustration that discrimination didn't always come in the form of slurs and overt hatred. Sometimes it looked like a pleasant-faced flight attendant with a smile and a can of hairspray. Captain Hayes had retired a year after the incident, but not before using his position to advocate for diversity in airline leadership. His final act had been recommending a young black woman pilot for a fast-track captain program, explicitly citing the need for diverse perspectives in positions of authority. "We can't rely on individual good actors like me happening to be in the cockpit," he'd said in his retirement speech. "We need systemic representation at every level." Anne Margaret Sullivan, the retired teacher who'd spoken up that day, had become an activist in her own right. She'd started volunteering with organizations fighting hair discrimination, using her position as an older white woman to speak to other white people about their biases. "I lived 60 years without really seeing this issue," she'd tell church groups and book clubs and anyone who would listen. "I taught for 30 years and didn't challenge dress codes that targeted black students. That ends now. We're never too old to learn, never too settled to change." But the most profound changes were the quietest ones. The other passengers from Flight 447 who'd gone home and had conversations with their children about discrimination. The people who'd seen the viral video and examined their own assumptions. The parents who'd stopped telling their black daughters to make their hair neater for school photos. The teachers who'd revised dress codes. The managers who'd looked at their hiring practices with fresh eyes. Change rippled outward in ways that could never be fully measured or attributed. But it happened, one conversation and one policy and one moment of courage at a time. As for Simone and Zara, they continued their lives in New York, their Sunday morning hair ritual remaining sacred. Simone continued her work as a surgeon and became increasingly involved in medical education, training the next generation of doctors to recognize and combat their own biases. She'd been promoted to head of her department, one of the few black women in such a position, and she used that platform ruthlessly to advocate for equity. Zara grew up as children do. She became known in her school as the girl who'd stood up to discrimination, though she wore that label lightly. She was more interested in science and space and the possibility of becoming an astronaut. But she never forgot the lesson from Flight 447. Never forgot that her existence was political whether she wanted it to be or not. Never forgot that taking up space was an act of resistance. When she was 12, a teacher suggested she straighten her hair for the school's award ceremony. Zara had looked the teacher in the eye and said calmly but firmly, "My hair is fine as it is. If you have a problem with natural black hair, that's something you should examine." The teacher had stammered an apology, backtracked, and Zara had attended the ceremony with her afro full and proud. Simone had gotten a call from the principal about the incident. "I wanted to let you know there was a situation with Zara and her teacher. The principal had started, sounding worried. "Let me guess," Simone had said dryly. "Someone commented on her hair and she stood up for herself?" "Well, yes. I wanted to make sure you knew. I do now. And I'm proud of her. Is there anything else?" There hadn't been. Because Zara hadn't been rude or aggressive. She'd simply refused to accept that her natural appearance was inappropriate. She'd done exactly what Simone had taught her, stood tall, spoke her truth and refused to shrink. And that was the real victory. Not the viral video or the policy changes or Karen Matthews losing her job. The real victory was Zara at 12, confident enough to push back against discrimination without her mother there to do it for her. The real victory was a generation of black children growing up with one less message telling them to change, because people like Simone had fought to make the world a little bit better. The incident on Flight 447 eventually faded from the news cycle, as all stories do. But it left marks. In Prestige Airlines' policy manual. In dozens of other airlines that updated their own policies in response. In the training materials used across the service industry. In the viral video that got shared every time someone posted about hair discrimination, serving as proof that it happened, that it mattered, that standing up made a difference. And it left marks on the people who lived through it. Simone carried it as a reminder that you never knew when you'd be called to stand up, when an ordinary day would become a moment that defined you. Zara carried it as her origin story, the day she learned both the ugliness of discrimination and the power of resistance. Jessica carried it as the moment she found her voice. Michael Chen carried it as an example of why his work mattered. Even Karen Matthews carried it, though differently. She'd never really apologized, never publicly acknowledged that what she did was wrong. But privately, in therapy sessions she'd finally committed to, she was slowly, painfully unpacking the beliefs she'd absorbed without questioning. It was harder than she'd expected, facing the ways she'd hurt people, examining the assumptions she'd built a lifetime on. Maybe she'd never fully get there. Maybe she'd never truly understand. But the fact that she was trying it all was more than she'd done in 52 years before Flight 447. And that, perhaps, was the most honest truth about these stories of discrimination and resistance. They rarely ended with perfect redemption or complete transformation. They ended with incremental change, with painful growth, with victories that were real but incomplete. They ended with more work to be done, more battles to fight, more moments requiring courage. But they also ended with hope. Hope that each confrontation made the next one a little easier. Hope that each person who stood up made it safer for the next person to do the same. Hope that the world Zara would navigate as an adult would be better than the one Simone had navigated, just as Simone's world was better than her grandmother's had been. Progress wasn't a straight line. It was a spiral, circling the same issues at different elevations, each time getting a little bit closer to justice. And every person who refused to stay silent, who rejected the idea that black children needed to change to be acceptable, who stood up despite the personal cost, they all added to that upward momentum. So when people asked Simone if she regretted how she handled Flight 447, if she thought she should have been calmer or more diplomatic or less confrontational, her answer was always the same. My 8-year-old daughter woke up to find a stranger trying to touch her hair without permission because that stranger thought my child's natural appearance was a problem. No, I don't regret stopping that. I don't regret making it clear that we don't accept that treatment. I don't regret showing my daughter that she's worth defending. The only thing I regret is that we live in a world where I had to. And then she'd usually add with a small smile, but I'm grateful we live in a world where enough people stood up with me to make a difference. Where the captain and the lawyer and the other passengers refused to stay silent. Where the video went viral and forced people to confront what discrimination actually looks like. Where my daughter learned that she doesn't have to face this alone. Because that was the other truth, the one that made the fight bearable. You weren't alone. For every Karen Matthews trying to police black bodies and black hair and black existence, there were people like Captain Hayes and Jessica Martinez and Margaret Sullivan, people who would stand up when it mattered. Not enough of them yet, maybe. Not as quickly or consistently as needed. But they existed and their numbers were growing. Every viral video of discrimination sparked 100 private conversations. Every public stand created space for others to stand too. Every policy change made it a little bit safer to demand equity. It was slow. It was exhausting. It required black people to constantly relive their trauma by sharing their stories, to perform their pain for an audience that should have already believed them. But it was working. Inch by inch, story by story, the world was changing. And Simone and Zara had played their part in that change, even though they'd never asked for it, even though it had cost them the peace of an ordinary flight. Years from now, when Zara was an adult, maybe an astronaut, maybe a doctor like her mother, maybe something else entirely, she'd look back on Flight 447 as a formative moment. Not a trauma that defined her, but a lesson that shaped her. The day she learned that the world wasn't always fair but that she had the right to demand fairness anyway. The day she learned that her mother would protect her and that eventually she'd have to protect herself. The day she learned that her existence was enough, that she didn't owe anyone comfort or conformity, that her natural self was exactly who she was meant to be. And maybe, on some Sunday morning in the distant future, Zara would sit her own daughter down and carefully pick out her afro, telling her stories. Stories about her grandfather Marcus who started the tradition. Stories about her mother Simone who protected it. Stories about a flight attendant who tried to make her shrink and how that moment became a catalyst for change. She'd tell those stories while her daughter squirmed and asked questions and eventually grew still, absorbed in the ritual and the history it carried. And she'd pass down what had been passed to her. That your hair is beautiful, that you are enough, that taking up space is your birthright, that some people won't understand but their discomfort is not your responsibility. And that would be the ultimate victory. Not just surviving discrimination but transcending it. Not just fighting for space but claiming it so fully that the next generation inherited it as their due. Not just standing up in one moment on one flight, but creating a legacy of resistance that echoed through generations. That's what Simone had given Zara on Flight 447. Not just protection in that moment, but a blueprint for every moment that would come after. A template for standing tall, speaking truth, refusing to shrink. A demonstration that love sometimes looked like fierce protection, that motherhood sometimes required making scenes, that the comfortable path wasn't always the right one. And that's what this story gives to everyone who hears it. Not just the details of one incident of discrimination, but a reminder that these moments matter. That how we respond defines us. That staying silent in the face of injustice makes us complicit. That standing up is hard but necessary. That change is possible but requires each of us to play our part. If you've made it this far in this story, you're not just a passive observer. You're part of the conversation about what kind of world we're creating. About whether Black children should have to defend their right to exist naturally. About whether we collectively have the courage to confront bias when we see it. About whether we're willing to make the uncomfortable choices that lead to necessary change. So here's my question for you. What will you do the next time you witness discrimination? Will you pull out your phone like Michael Chen? Will you speak up like Margaret Sullivan? Will you use your authority like Captain Hayes? Will you find your courage like Jessica Martinez? Or will you look away, stay comfortable, tell yourself it's not your business? Because it is your business. It's all of our business. Every time a child is told their natural self isn't acceptable. Every time someone is profiled or othered or diminished. Every time injustice happens in front of witnesses who choose silence. The world changes when enough people refuse that silence. When enough people decide that a child's dignity matters more than their own comfort. When enough people recognize that discrimination thrives in quiet complicity and dies in the light of accountability. Simone and Zara's story isn't over. They're still out there, living their lives, facing new challenges, creating new moments of resistance and joy. And so are countless other families navigating similar waters, fighting similar battles, deserving similar support. Their story is a reminder that ordinary people in ordinary moments can make extraordinary choices. That one mother's fierce love for her daughter, witnessed and amplified by strangers turned allies, can ripple outward into policy changes and cultural shifts and a slightly more just world. It's a reminder that you don't have to be perfect to be brave. That standing up is messy and uncomfortable and doesn't always feel heroic in the moment. But that it matters anyway. That your voice matters. That your witness matters. That your refusal to accept injustice as inevitable matters. And it's a reminder that for every Karen Matthews trying to police and control and diminish, there are people ready to stand against that. People who recognize beauty and dignity and worth. People who believe that an 8-year-old's afro is perfect exactly as it is. People who understand that the real problem was never Zara's hair, it was the bias that looked at a sleeping Black child and saw something that needed fixing. This is the world we're building together. One stand at a time. One policy change at a time. One conversation at a time. One child raised to know their worth at a time. It's imperfect and ongoing and requires constant vigilance. But it's moving in the right direction, pulled forward by people who refuse to accept that this is as good as it gets. So carry this story with you. Let it inform how you see the world, how you respond to injustice, how you use whatever privilege or platform or power you have. Let it remind you that silence is a choice with consequences, and so is speaking up. Let it challenge you to be the person who stands up rather than the person who looks away. And if you're a black parent reading this, exhausted from fighting these battles, from having to prepare your children for discrimination they haven't yet faced, from carrying the weight of making your kids confident while keeping them safe, know that you're not alone. Know that what you're doing matters. Know that every Sunday morning hair ritual, every affirmation of their beauty, every time you stand between them and the world's cruelty, you're building something powerful. You're raising children who know their worth. And that knowledge, that unshakable sense of self, that's the foundation of revolution. The flight attendant thought she could fix a little black girl's hair 35,000 feet in the air. Instead, she sparked a conversation that reached millions. She meant to diminish, she inadvertently amplified. She tried to police, she catalyzed change. And in trying to make one child smaller, she made the movement for justice bigger. That's the power of standing up. That's the alchemy of refusing to accept injustice. That's what happens when a mother's love meets a moment of choice and decides that enough is enough. That's what happened on Flight 447. And that's why it matters. Your hair is beautiful. You are enough. Take up space. And when someone tries to tell you different, stand tall, speak truth, and never shrink yourself to make them comfortable. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's the revolution, one Afro at a time.